What happens when a sitting governor walks into what he thinks is a friendly late-night interview, only to find himself in the middle of a carefully orchestrated ambush? What you're about to witness is one of the most shocking moments in late-night television history, where political pleasantries turned into a verbal bloodbath that left an entire studio audience speechless. This isn't just another political interview gone wrong. This is the story of how Governor JB Pritzker went from confident guest to persona non grata in less than 20 minutes, and why Jimmy Kimmel made the unprecedented decision to physically remove a sitting governor from his show. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below because this story has layers that will blow your mind. The evening started like any other taping of Jimmy Kimmel Live. The studio buzzed with its usual pre-show energy, audience members settling into their seats, cameras being positioned for optimal angles. Governor Pritzker had arrived early, spending time in the green room reviewing talking points with his communications team. They had prepared for the standard late-night fare, jokes about Illinois politics, maybe some light ribbing about Chicago deep dish pizza versus New York style. The governor's team felt confident after all. Kimmel had been relatively gentle with Democratic politicians in recent years. What they didn't know was that Jimmy Kimmel had spent the better part of 2 weeks preparing for this interview in a way that was completely unprecedented for his show. Behind the scenes, his production team had been digging deep into Pritzker's record, not for comedy material, but for hard-hitting questions that would make a seasoned political journalist proud. The host had become increasingly frustrated with what he saw as softball interviews across all late-night television, and he had decided that Governor Pritzker would be the perfect target to demonstrate that comedy shows could do serious journalism when it mattered. The governor walked onto the stage to the usual fanfare, waving to the audience as the band played him in. He settled into the guest chair with the practiced ease of someone who had done hundreds of these appearances. The first few minutes proceeded exactly as expected. Kimmel opened with a joke about Illinois weather, Pritzker laughed on cue, they exchanged pleasantries about the governor's family, and the audience warmed up with gentle laughter. Everything seemed to be going according to the standard late-night playbook. But then something shifted in Kimmel's demeanor. The host's smile became more fixed, his posture straightened, and there was a noticeable pause as he shuffled through his note cards. The audience sensed the change too, the laughter dying down as they waited for the next segment. Pritzker, still operating under the assumption that this was a friendly interview, continued to smile and nod, completely unaware that he was about to walk into a trap that had been months in the making. Kimmel leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a more serious tone that immediately caught the governor off guard. The host's usual comedic timing was replaced by something more deliberate, more calculated. The cameras zoomed in slightly, capturing every micro-expression on both men's faces as the temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees. The first real question came like a surgical strike. Kimmel asked about specific budget allocations that had been buried deep in committee reports, numbers that most people, including many journalists, hadn't bothered to dig up. The governor's media training kicked in immediately, but there was a flicker of surprise in his eyes that the cameras caught perfectly. This wasn't supposed to be happening. Late-night hosts didn't ask about line items in state budgets. They asked about funny stories and upcoming initiatives that made for good sound bites. Pritzker attempted to deflect with humor, making a joke about boring government paperwork that would normally get a laugh and allow him to pivot to safer territory. But Kimmel didn't laugh. The audience didn't laugh. Instead, the host pressed forward with a follow-up question that was even more specific, even more pointed. The governor's communications team, watching from the wings, began to exchange worried glances. The questions kept coming, each one more targeted than the last. Kimmel had clearly done his homework, and he wasn't interested in letting the governor off the hook with vague political non-answers. The host asked about campaign contributions, about policy decisions that seemed to contradict the governor's public statements, about meetings that were supposed to be private, but had somehow made their way into Kimmel's research files. With each question, Pritzker's composure began to crack just a little bit more. His answers became longer, more defensive, filled with the kind of political doublespeak that might work in a press conference but sounded increasingly hollow under the bright lights of the television studio. The audience, initially confused by the shift in tone, began to sense that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The governor's team watched in horror as their carefully planned media appearance began to unravel in real time. This was supposed to be a friendly platform to discuss upcoming initiatives and maybe get in a few good lines that would play well on social media. Instead, their boss was being grilled like a defendant in a criminal trial, and the questions showed no signs of letting up. Kimmel's preparation became more apparent with each passing minute. He had documents, he had sources, he had specific dates and times that contradicted statements the governor had made in other forums. This wasn't just a comedian trying to make political jokes. This was a methodical dismantling of carefully constructed political narratives, and it was happening in front of a live studio audience and millions of viewers at home. The governor began to show signs of real frustration. His voice raised slightly, his gestures became more animated, and there were moments where he seemed to forget that he was on national television. The mask of political polish was slipping, revealing something raw and angry underneath. The audience could feel the tension building, and many of them began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. But Jimmy Kimmel was just getting started. The host had saved his most explosive material for later in the interview, and as the conversation continued, it became clear that this was not going to end well for anyone involved. The stage was set for a confrontation that would go down in television history, and neither man was prepared to back down. What happened next would become the moment that defined this entire confrontation. Kimmel reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder thick with documents that he placed deliberately on his desk. The sound of the folder hitting the surface echoed through the suddenly silent studio like a gavel in a courtroom. Pritzker's eyes immediately locked onto the folder, and for the first time since the interview began, genuine concern flashed across his face. The host opened the folder slowly, methodically, as if he were savoring the moment. Inside were printouts of emails, financial records, and what appeared to be internal memos that no late-night comedian should have had access to. The governor's communications director, watching from backstage, immediately began making frantic phone calls, trying to figure out how sensitive documents had ended up in Jimmy Kimmel's possession. Kimmel pulled out the first document and held it up for the cameras to see, though he was careful not to reveal too much detail to the home audience. The paper was clearly official, with government letterhead and signatures that looked authentic. The governor's face went pale as he recognized what he was looking at, and his previously animated demeanor shifted to something much more guarded and defensive. The host began reading from the document, his voice steady and measured. He quoted specific passages that directly contradicted statements Pritzker had made during previous interviews and public appearances. These weren't vague inconsistencies that could be explained away with political spin. These were direct contradictions that showed the governor had been saying one thing in public while doing something completely different behind closed doors. Pritzker interrupted, his voice rising for the first time since the interview began. He demanded to know where Kimmel had obtained those documents, suggesting that they might be forgeries or taken out of context. The governor's political instincts were kicking in, but his anger was starting to show through the professional facade. He pointed at the folder accusingly, his finger jabbing toward Kimmel's desk as he spoke. The host remained calm, almost eerily so, as he responded to the governor's accusations. He explained that every document had been verified through multiple sources, that his research team had spent weeks confirming the authenticity of everything in the folder. Kimmel's tone was matter-of-fact, almost clinical, which only seemed to increase Pritzker's frustration. The audience watched in stunned silence as the two men faced off across the desk. This had gone far beyond uncomfortable television. This was a full-scale political ambush happening in real time, and everyone in the studio could feel the explosive tension building between the host and his guest. Some audience members began to look toward the exits, sensing that this situation was spiraling out of control. Kimmel pulled out another document, this one appearing to be a series of text messages or emails. He began reading selected portions. Aloud, and with each line, Pritzker's composure cracked a little bit more. The governor's face flushed red, his hands clenched into fists on the arms of his chair, and his voice took on a dangerous edge as he demanded that Kimmel stop reading from what he called stolen private communications. The host looked up from the documents and stared directly at the governor, his expression cold and unforgiving. He told Pritzker that nothing he was reading was stolen, that everything had been obtained through proper legal channels, and that the governor's anger was misplaced. Kimmel suggested that instead of being angry at him for reading the documents, perhaps Pritzker should be angry at himself for writing them in the first place. That comment hit like a physical blow. The governor's face contorted with rage, and he leaned forward in his chair as if he were about to stand up. His voice, when he spoke, was barely controlled fury. He accused Kimmel of ambushing him, of violating the basic trust that exists between a host and guest, of turning what should have been a friendly interview into a political hit job. Kimmel's response was devastating in its simplicity. He told the governor that trust was a two-way street, and that perhaps if Pritzker had been more honest with the people of Illinois, there wouldn't be so many contradictions to discuss. The host's voice remained level, but there was steel underneath the calm exterior. He was not backing down, and he was not apologizing for his approach. The governor stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward from the force of his movement. The audience gasped audibly, and several people in the front rows actually leaned back in their seats. Pritzker towered over the desk, pointing down at Kimmel with undisguised anger. He declared that he would not sit there and be ambushed by a comedian who thought he was a journalist, that this was not what he had agreed to when he accepted the invitation to appear on the show. Kimmel remained seated, looking up at the standing governor with an expression that was equal parts defiant and satisfied. He told Pritzker that he was welcome to leave at any time, but that running away from hard questions was exactly the kind of behavior that had gotten him into this situation. In the first place, the host's words were like gasoline on a fire, and the governor's anger reached a boiling point. The studio audience was completely silent now, watching this unprecedented confrontation unfold before their eyes. Many of them had their phones out, recording what they sensed was a historic moment in television history. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every word, every gesture, every moment of this explosive face-off between a sitting governor and a late-night host who had clearly decided to throw out the traditional playbook. Pritzker's security detail, positioned strategically around the studio, began to move closer to the stage. They could see that their principal was losing control, and they were prepared to intervene if the situation escalated further. The governor's communications team was in full panic mode, trying to figure out how to salvage what had become a complete disaster. The governor leaned over Kimmel's desk, his face inches from the host's, and spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper but filled with menace. He told Kimmel that he had made a serious mistake, that there would be consequences for this ambush, and that the host had no idea who he was dealing with. The threat was clear, even if the specific words were vague. Kimmel's response would prove to be the final straw that pushed this confrontation beyond the point of no return. The host leaned back in his chair, smiled coldly, and delivered a line that would be replayed on news shows for weeks to come. He told the governor that he knew exactly who he was dealing with, and that was precisely why he had prepared so thoroughly for this interview. The battle lines were drawn, and neither man was prepared to surrender. What happened in the next 30 seconds would go down as one of the most shocking moments in late-night television history. Pritzker, still leaning over Kimmel's desk with his face flushed red with anger, made a fatal mistake. He grabbed the manila folder containing all of Kimmel's research documents and threw it across the stage. Papers scattered everywhere, floating through the air like confetti as the audience gasped in unison. The sound of the folder hitting the studio wall echoed through the suddenly silent space. Kimmel's expression changed instantly. The cold, calculated demeanor he had maintained throughout the entire confrontation vanished, replaced by something much more primal. The host stood up slowly, his chair rolling backward as he rose to his full height. For the first time since the interview began, Kimmel looked genuinely angry. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but filled with unmistakable authority. He told the governor that he had just made the biggest mistake of his political career. Kimmel explained that those documents represented weeks of careful research and preparation, and that by destroying them, Pritzker had shown complete disrespect, not just for the host, but for the entire process of journalism and accountability. The host's words were measured and deliberate, each one landing like a hammer blow. The governor, realizing that he had crossed a line, attempted to backtrack. He tried to laugh off his action, suggesting that it was just a moment of frustration and that they should move on with the interview. But Kimmel was having none of it. The host walked around his desk, stepping over the scattered papers, and moved closer to where Pritzker was standing. The cameras followed every step, capturing the unprecedented scene of a late-night host confronting a sitting governor. Kimmel's production team, watching from the control room, was frantically trying to decide whether to cut to commercial or let the confrontation play out. The show's executive producer was on the phone with network executives, but the decision was ultimately made to keep the cameras rolling. This was television history in the making, and everyone involved knew it. The host stopped directly in front of the governor and delivered what would become one of the most quoted lines in late-night television history. He told Pritzker that if he thought he could come onto the show, lie to the American people, and then destroy evidence when confronted with the truth, he was gravely mistaken. Kimmel's voice rose as he spoke, his anger finally breaking through the controlled facade he had maintained throughout the interview. Pritzker's security detail began moving toward the stage, but the governor waved them off. He was still trying to salvage the situation, still believing that his political skills could somehow turn this disaster around. He attempted to regain control by pointing out that this was supposed to be an entertainment show, not a political tribunal, and that Kimmel had violated the basic rules of television hospitality. The host's response was swift and devastating. He told the governor that hospitality was a privilege that had to be earned through honesty and respect, neither of which Pritzker had shown. Kimmel pointed to the scattered papers on the floor and declared that the governor's actions had demonstrated exactly the kind of character that made him unfit for public office. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word of this unprecedented confrontation. What happened next shocked everyone in the studio. Pritzker, his face purple with rage, stepped forward and poked his finger directly into Kimmel's chest. The physical contact sent a ripple of tension through the audience, and several people actually stood up from their seats. The governor's voice was shaking with anger as he told Kimmel that he would not be lectured by a failed comedian who had never held real responsibility in his life. That physical contact was the final straw for Jimmy Kimmel. The host stepped back, looked directly into the camera, and made an announcement that stunned everyone watching. He told the home audience that this interview was over, that Governor Pritzker had violated the basic rules of civil discourse, and that he was no longer welcome on the show. Kimmel's voice was calm again, but there was a finality to his words. That left no room for argument. The governor laughed bitterly, suggesting that Kimmel didn't have the authority to kick him off the show. He pointed out that this was live television, that millions of people were watching, and that the host couldn't simply end the interview because he didn't like how it was going. Pritzker's political instincts were still functioning, and he believed that public pressure would force Kimmel to continue. But Jimmy Kimmel had already made his decision. He walked back to his desk, picked up his phone, and made a call to security. His voice was loud enough for the microphones to pick up, as he requested that Governor Pritzker be escorted from the building immediately. The host then looked directly at the camera and told the home audience that they had just witnessed why transparency and accountability mattered in politics. The studio erupted in chaos as security personnel began moving toward the stage. Pritzker's own security detail was caught in an impossible situation, unsure whether to protect their principal from the show's security or to facilitate his removal from the premises. The governor's communications team was screaming into their phones, trying to reach anyone who might be able to stop this unprecedented situation. Governor Pritzker, finally realizing that this was actually happening, that he was actually being kicked off a national television show, made one last desperate attempt to regain control. He turned to the audience and tried to address them directly, attempting to paint himself as the victim of an unfair ambush. But his words were drowned out by the commotion as security personnel reached the stage. The removal itself was surprisingly civil. The security team, professional and efficient, simply surrounded the governor and began escorting him toward the exit. Pritzker didn't resist physically, but he continued to speak loudly, making statements about the unfairness of the situation, and promising that there would be consequences for what had happened. Jimmy Kimmel remained at his desk, watching the unprecedented scene unfold with an expression that was equal parts satisfaction and disbelief. As the governor was led away, the host looked directly into the camera and delivered his final words. On the subject, he told the audience that accountability was not optional, that public servants needed to be held to the highest standards, and that no one, regardless of their position, was above answering hard questions honestly. The studio audience remained silent until Governor Pritzker had completely left the building. Then, as if a spell had been broken, they erupted in applause that lasted for nearly 2 minutes. Kimmel stood at his desk, accepting the ovation, but his expression remained serious. He knew that what had just happened would have far-reaching consequences that went well beyond a single television show. As the applause finally died down, Kimmel looked directly into the camera one final time and delivered his closing message. He reminded viewers that democracy depended on holding elected officials accountable, and that sometimes that accountability came from unexpected places. The host then did something unprecedented. He dedicated the rest of the show to discussing the importance of government transparency and the role of media in maintaining democratic institutions. So there you have it, the complete story of how Governor JB Pritzker went from confident guest to expelled politician in less than 20 minutes of television. Make sure to subscribe for more incredible stories like this one, and drop a comment below telling us what you think about accountability in politics. Should late-night hosts be asking these kinds of hard questions, or should they stick to entertainment? Let us know what you think.